Greetings, adventurers. This is Lorne, your guild advisor. Welcome to my review and spoiler talk for Is It Wrong to Try to Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon, Volume 15. Now, this novel has already been out for over a month, and I've been a bit late on that. I did episode Freya last week, and now we're finally getting into the continuation of the main series, Volume 15. Now, just a preface for the video, this first part will be a very short general review, and then the big bulk of the video will be a spoiler discussion on the contents of the novel itself, because if you're here at volume 15, I think by this point you know whether or not you want to keep continuing your reading of the entire series. But if for some reason you have not read 15 yet and want my general impressions of the novel, here you go. DanMachi 15 is the 15th installment of the light novel series. The author is of course Fujino Omori, who writes for the main series as well as the side series Sword of Victoria and Familiar Chronicle. It is illustrated by Suzuhito Yasuda. The translation this time is done by Starr, who is new to doing the main series translations. Volumes 11 through 14 were translated by Winifred Bird, and now it seems like it has a new translator who is now Starr, and I thought the translation was fine for this volume. But it's so interesting because Volume 14 released last December, or December of 2019, and it's been about a year's time to wait between 14 and 15, so I don't know if there had to been some change of translator within that time. That explains why it took so long for 15 to come out, but I'm glad it finally did. And of course, the series is published by Yen Press. Now with Volume 15, it's not necessarily a volume that moves the plot forward in any meaningful sense, as it reads more like a 0.5 volume you might see in other series, where we're really just getting a bit more about the characters themselves, or learn about more of their backstories. And Omori Sensei says in the afterword that a portion of the short stories that you will see in this volume are revised versions of stories he's written for the 2015 Blu-ray set, which is for the Season 1 of DanMachi's anime adaptation. So a lot of those stories that were featured for Japanese buyers of that content are here in this story, but revised a bit to fit the current timeline in the DanMachi series with this 15th installment. Now, with that being said, I did like the additional backstories we got for the characters here, though two of them we kind of seen already if you play DanMemo, which is the DanMachi mobile game, and that is part of the goddess Campanella story, which is an event in DanMemo where they adapted the Campanella story from Volume 4, which was not adapted into the anime, and also includes elements of two stories that you will find here in DanMachi Volume 15. So in that sense, it was a tiny bit disappointing to me because I already knew about those stories because I've seen them in the mobile game, and seeing as this is a follow-up to Volume 14, I really just wanted to see more new content, though it is nice to see those stories written in light novel format rather than the mobile game form. But again, I just wish we got more of a progression from what we've seen in 14. But the way 15 is structured, it's almost like an extended epilogue from what happened in 14. We get to see where the characters now stand, where they are, how they've grown. We do get a bit into how the events of the past few volumes have affected Belle's mind. And it's somewhat refreshing in a way, because a lot of the times in many like anime or light novel series, you'll have the protagonist go through these dire circumstances, these crazy situations, and those situations don't really affect them too much. Like, they kind of just brush it off and move into the next arc or next fight. But here in Volume 15, you see that Belle is still trying to recover from what happened in the events of the past novel. So that's a really cool thing to see, and probably something that you can really only do with a novel like this, where it's just a more laid-back volume, just having the cast members recover from what happened previously. So to sum it all up, Volume 15 isn't a story that propels the overall narrative forward, but it does give us a bigger appreciation for the main cast of characters and where they came from and how they got to where they are now in the present day story. We get to see how the events of the past few volumes have changed them and shaped them into who they are now. And that's one thing I've continually praised about Omori Sensei's writing, how he seems to care about the cast of characters he's created and giving them the attention that they deserve and not just focusing on one particular character in general. So overall, Volume 15 is a fine read. It doesn't move the plot forward, but again, it gives you that appreciation for the other characters in the story. And with that out of the way, we're going to dive into the spoiler discussion for the events that happen in this story. So if you have not read Volume 15 yet, just go ahead and exit the video. Thanks for coming, but there are timestamps in this video so you can avoid those spoiler points. The story starts off with Bell still having his injured arm in a sling and him mentioning that Amid is very angry at him. And for those of you who have read Sword of Retoria Volume 12, those events, I believe they happen in the middle of 15 because it seems that Volume 15, at least the start of it, happens first, and then Volume 12 of Sword of Retoria happens somewhere in the middle, and then Volume 15 happens, or the rest of Volume 15 happens after Sword of Retoria Volume 12. So very interesting how that worked out. The only thing I kind of complain about here is that you don't really get a reference to anything that happens in Sword of Retoria Volume 12, which is really odd considering the scale of events that happen in that novel. It's really weird that we don't get any of that mentioned here in Volume 15. And Volume 15 was indeed like released first before Sword of Retoria Volume 12, so maybe that's why. But just like a little nod or a little reference would have been nice, because it's just so weird for the stuff that happens in Volume 12 to not be mentioned here in the main series, Volume 15. And we do have that cute little scene where Cassandra wants to have like that extended talk with Bell, and then Bell acknowledges that they will have that talk at one point, though it hasn't happened yet, or we haven't seen that happen in Volume 15, and because it is skipping around in time, I wonder if that's already happened in Volume 15, or we're gonna see what that conversation is in Volume 16. But Cassandra is a very interesting character in regards to her visions and how she sees Bell as someone very special to her, because even though Bell may not completely believe in Cassandra's visions like 100%, he does have the kindness to at least give his attention to that and be aware of what she's saying. So very interested to see if Cassandra might get more visions during that conversation with Bell, and if that's addressed at all in Volume 16. And as I mentioned in my general review for Volume 15, I really appreciate how Omori Sensei has stated that Bell has been having trouble like sleeping through the night after the events of Volume 14, because in Volume 14 he could only sleep like every 5 minutes or so before he and Ryu had to like switch off and then keep on moving throughout the dungeon in floor 37, because they were not in the best conditions at all during that entire time. And that's still affecting Bell. Like, he's still waking up really early, being super alert, and you do get that wholesome moment between Haruhime and Bell as Haruhime like makes notice of this and then tries to comfort Bell as she tries to get him to go back to sleep. And we learn a bit more about that during Haruhime's portion of the novel. And it's really funny how Mikoto is guarding that door. Like, she knows what Haruhime is doing, but she knows that Hestia and Lily are definitely not going to be liking what Haruhime is doing based on where Haruhime's background is, coming from the Pleasure Quarter. So it's cool that Mikoto has Haruhime's back when Haruhime is trying to comfort Bell. Like, you see the Hestia Familia really caring for one another and making sure that certain Familia members don't take notice of what's happening here. And even Welf acknowledges this during his conversation with Bell. But again, really cool to see that Bell is having these types of problems, because a lot of the times, as I mentioned in the general review, many protagonists in other stories kind of just brush this stuff off and then just move on to the next fight. Like, well, hold on, you just gone through like this nightmare of a scenario, you're just gonna say like, on to the next one, boys. No, this is actually affecting Bell. And so we go into the first short story in the novel about Bell. The interesting thing about this is that one of the first adventurers he meets at the gates of Arario is Hashina, and if you remember, he is a Ganesha Familia member, and he is the Ganesha Familia member that died due to Ravis in Volume 2 of Sword of Retoria. So it's cool to have that one character come back in this instance and be relevant again. So again, Omori Sensei making good use of the characters he's made and seeing Hashina again right here before his untimely death. But there isn't too much to say about this short story with Bell making his way through Arario, but it's cool that Bell remembers this innkeeper that gave him that rye bread when Bell stayed at that inn when he was just looking for a familia and really having a hard time trying to find one before he, of course, meets Hestia. So it's cool that Bell gave notice of that person, even though he's this level 4 adventurer who should be super famous and not really take notice of this guy. So Bell is basically just still staying humble. And again, a lot of the elements in the stories here for Bell and Hestia were in the DanMemo Campanella event. Elements of those were in that event. So as I'm reading through these two short stories about Bell and Hestia, it's kind of, it's not disappointing me in a sense, but I wish I got more new material. But reading through the Bell and Hestia stories is me going, man, I've kind of read these already in a different medium through the mobile game, and I really wish I got more new material with Volume 15. But it's really me just wanting to see more progression of the plot, and other people saying or hinting that Volume 16 is crazy, but I'm doing my best to avoid any Volume 16 spoilers. And one of the first things that Bell does when he gets into Arario is visit the Adventurer's Graveyard, and he sees that black memorial dedicated to the ancient heroes, the ones in the dungeon Oratoria, and we learn a bit more about that towards the end of this novel. And we get back into the interlude where Bell is watching Lily and Mikito play shogi, which is a fun thing to see, because later on we see that Lily has adopted some of the Far East mannerisms when she's thanking Daphne for tutoring her to be like this tactician, the strategist of the Familia. So it's cool how Omori Sensei is like getting his characters to develop in just these subtle ways, how Lily's adopting more of these Far East mannerisms. And then we have a little wholesome moment between Hestia and Bell as Hestia is making that fire. And Hestia asks Bell to stay with her always. And Bell just kind of has this silent recognition of that and silently accepts that he will do that. And then we have the Hestia short story, basically how she came down from heaven and then went into Arario and eventually found Bell. One cool touch is that Bell actually saw Hestia's fallen star as she's descending down into the mortal realm. And one interesting thing about when Hestia gets into Arario and then the first goddess she meets is Loki is that Lafia is accompanying Loki in this instance. And as far as I believe, as far as I remember, this is actually the first time that Lafia has been name dropped in the main series. She's had cameo appearances in the anime adaptations of the main series, but I don't think she's ever been name dropped in the main series until this very moment in Volume 15. It's funny how the moment that Lafia gets name dropped is really just during this transitional volume that's really more of an epilogue of Volume 14 more than anything else. But Lafia is finally mentioned in the main series proper. So to those of you that ship Bell and Lafia, you now have a 0.01% chance hope of those two, because Lafia is finally in the main series. And before I get into Lily's interlude, I do want to mention I like how the illustrations are handled, where there's that opening illustration for the interlude, and then an illustration for the actual opening of the short story, and how they have two caricatures of characters, and with one being prominent and the other one being a shadow, and then that's flipped for the other part of the story. Finally, guys, Lily is now level 2, and she got that by getting her magic to that D ranks. And anytime one of your main status attributes are at a D rank, you can level up if you have that heroic feat that allows you to do so, and defeating the Amphisbaenia is definitely a feat worthy of that. And it is interesting how we learn later on during Haruhime's chapter that Aisha mentions, you get half the Excelia if you have a level boost during that time you're fighting. And it makes you wonder like how much higher everyone's stats would have been. And I do like how Lily's trying to decide between two different skills, whether or not she should take that potion making one or just that resistance to basically ailments like poison, and she takes that resistance because it's just something that will help her support Bell as they dive deeper and deeper into the dungeon. That resistance is going to be more helpful to Belle than learning potion making, which Lily says, which she recognizes that they can get from Mëdiocre Familia because they are allied. And I really like the self-confidence boost that this level up has given Lily. Like, it's nice to see how someone who's came from such a really sad background, as you learn later on in the short story, just rise up and eventually become level 2. It's really hard to believe that Omori sensei was planning on never leveling up Lily, because I'm glad the editor was there and saying that Lily needs to level up, because it really wouldn't make sense for Lily not to level up at any point during this story, especially if volume 14 is the halfway point. Like, how is Lily a supporter for this long and not getting a level up? And she just needs it to keep up with Belle, because it'd be strange for them to keep going deeper and deeper into the dungeon with Lily still being level 1. So I'm glad the editor stepped in and said, no, Lily needs to level up, and she needs that self-confidence boost. And we get to meet Ruan later on here, the person, the Prum from Apollo Familia, who ends up working at that Prum-only bar that we see in Volume 8. It's nice to see him brought back again with a fun little dialogue between him and Lily, and I really like Ruan in this instance. It's really strange how such a minor character, you can be happy to see them, and even he grows here because he tells Lily that she is stronger than him. And then we go into the Lily backstory. It's just super sad, because it's not like she was in Soma Familia by choice. Her parents were in Soma Familia and didn't really care for Lily that much. And not many people care for Lily at all during this entire short story. You had that little instance of Soma Familia being nice to her, giving her some of those potato snacks, and then basically it seemed that like Soma pretty much ignored everybody after Xanis took over and made everyone subjected to the Soma wine, and all of them are pretty much drunk on wanting to get more of it and just working for it. And so Lily had to be in that toxic environment. And one of the crazy things is that Xanis and Kanu were contemplating on like selling Lily to make money at the pleasure quarter to the brothel. And thank God that Chandra was in there, who later becomes the Familia captain after the events of the war game. Thank God he was there for that, because that would really stink. I don't want to see that. I don't want to imagine Lily in that environment. But the one creepy thing is that when Chandra convinces them to not sell her to the pleasure quarter, because what if Ishtar Familia finds out and thinks she's a spy, Xanis and Kanu kind of like say, oh, it's more fun if Lily stays in the Familia anyway. I'm like, what do you mean by more fun? Like, I don't want those thoughts in my head. I hope Lily is pure. That's all I'm saying. I hope Lily is pure. And thank God Belle ended up saving her from all of this, and the Familia got together and reformed the Soma Familia during the war game arc. Thank God that Soma Familia is in much better state than it was in previously. So now we move into the interlude with Aina, and this one's interesting because technically Hetsuya Familia's dungeon range is floor 37, but of course they kind of work with Aina to make a report that says that's not the case, because it's a very special circumstance. It's not like they ventured normally to get to floor 37. Belle and Ryu were swallowed by the worm well and then burrowed down into floor 37, and then the rest of Hetsuya Familia was escorted by the Zenos and the Tavern Ladies and Tsubuki into floor 37. So very different circumstances, and it's so strange to see that they technically failed the expedition, but they accomplished so much during it. And it's a good thing Oranos knows about this, but they accomplished so much. They defeated the Mas Huge, they escorted the parties for Dormal and Luvis back into safe territory, they defeated the regular floor boss Amphispanea, and then Ryu and Belle defeated the Juggernaut. So accomplished a lot, but technically not within the scope of their expedition, which is crazy to think about. But the one thing that this story about Aina stresses is that how she worked so much for these adventurers that many other guild employees just tried to not get themselves attached to, because of what can happen to these adventurers, how they brilliantly go into the dungeon where death is almost a certain thing to happen. And Aina goes above and beyond in helping those adventurers learn more about the dungeon, and then try to give them as much knowledge as possible so they don't die. And ironically, it's due to Belle, who Aina taught, that saves Dormal and Lubis, who Aina also taught. So it's kind of cool how these things end up wrapping up together. And we have that nice wholesome moment where Aina hugs Belle, and Belle thanks Aina for teaching her about the dungeon, because that knowledge that Aina has been drilling into Belle pretty much has been saving their lives. And it's so good for Aina to hear that because of everything that she's experienced and gone through. As we learn about during her short story, how she got with her first adventurer, her first assigned person, Maris, and how they eventually became good friends. And they didn't have the best initial meeting, but they did become good friends. But eventually Maris did fall to the realities of the dungeon. One thing I did note down is that Belle specifically requested for an elf guild employee, and something else that was said before was that Zeus remarked that Belle liked elves a lot. So it's just giving me this fuel for my Ryu ship. All this Belle preferring elves, but he has his eyes still set on Eyes Wallenstein, and we'll discuss a bit about her towards the end of this spoiler discussion video. And I do wish we got a scene with Aina, Reveria, and her mom, but it probably is not the best place to have that particular story here, where this volume 15 is really about where these people have come from and like what their beginnings were into getting into Aurario. So probably not the right place for that story, but I am still interested in the relationship between Aina's mom and herself and Reveria. So then we move into the Welf interlude, and he gets a very interesting skill, the Veritas Burn, which increases his fire proficiency. So I guess anytime he uses his new Welf magic sword, it's gonna be super strong because it is fire elements. And he presents that very sword to Hephaestus, and she calls it adequate, and that makes Welf super excited. So excited that he interrupts Hephaestus when she says, "All right, I'll go out with you," and she doesn't get to finish that. And it makes me go, "Welf, what are you doing? I praised you for like being so blunt and so serious when Hephaestus, like, I want you." And then you have this opportunity and you just throw it away because he's just too excited. And it's funny, like, she called my work adequate. This is the greatest moment of my life. Well, hopefully we see more of those two in the future, but man, it's a tiny bit frustrating. And then we move into Welf's little backstory more about his time in Rakia itself, and how he really didn't feel like he fit in because he didn't care much for the ways and nobility, and he was already in the Krotso family, who people really looked down upon because they were cursed to never make magic weapons again. Of course, we see later on that Welf did indeed get that skill after getting his blessing of Falna from Phobos. And Phobos is a very interesting character. Like, she's a very playful god, very sensual actually. When she opens Welf's Falna for conversion, she says, "At least I will always be your first time." And I knew she was going to say a line like that before I read it. Like, this is exactly the type of character that would say something like that. And she does indeed say that. And I was always interested in how, like, who Welf was blessed by before, because we know that the Krotso blood is a skill, so you needed Falna for him to acquire that. So someone had to have blessed him before Hephaestus. And it didn't make sense for it to be Ares, because why would Ares open up Welf for conversion? So now we know that there's this interesting system in the Kingdom of Rakia where, like, Ares has these subordinate gods. And that brings us into the Ryu interlude, which of course is when I'm paying super close attention because Ryu is my favorite character. But I assume this is where we're now in official post-Sotoratoria 12 territory, because they're celebrating the fact that Belle's cast is now off. And the interesting thing of note at the very beginning of this interlude is that they mention that Miak, Hephaestus, Hermes, and Demeter are meeting together and talking about stuff. And because of what we know of Sotoratoria Volume 12, I'm very interested in what's being discussed during this. Maybe we'll learn about that later on. But of course, we have the alliance between Hestia Familia, Miak Familia, and Take Mikazuchi Familia celebrating at the pub the hostess of fertility, or the benevolent mistress as is localized in the light novel. And man, we have Chloe up to her shenanigans again, saying, "Oh, Belle, you pledged your butt to me when we saved you." And Belle's like, I don't remember anything like that. freaking Chloe shenanigans. And we have Ryu, who's just doing her utmost best to avoid like any eye contact with Belle. Like, it's mentioned that she's making it super obvious because she's avoiding Belle with like defensive maneuvers you would expect to see in the dungeon. Like, it's just too obvious. And a lot of people make note of that. And the cool thing is that we get to see that Daphne and Cassandra are now level 3. So it's not just Hestia Familia that's benefiting from these level ups, but it's also Daphne and Cassandra who are now level 3. And we get that fun little tease from Naza saying that you better make use of your value now because we're going to have increased taxes. I love that. I love how we're seeing the dynamics of other familias. It's really cool. And then back to the topic of Ryu. We have Seer like ask Belle if anything happened between the two of them. And Belle thinks like, well, what might have caused this? And I like how Belle like does indeed take note that maybe the naked embracing thing might have something to do with it. Like, Belle's not completely clueless, right? And I'm very interested to see like what Seer is like thinking in her head about Ryu, and then her like Seer has to know, right? That Ryu likes Belle at this point. I'm just so curious about what Seer feels about this, because the entire time like Ryu has been pushing back her own feelings in favor of Seer, and I wonder how Seer is going to take that now when it's incredibly obvious that Ryu likes Belle. And even like when Mia is telling Ryu to go to this table, and then everyone like blatantly sees Ryu do her best to avoid Belle. Like, Naza teases, "Ah, youth." And we finally get to that point where Ryu's taking out the trash. Belle finds a time to actually talk to Ryu. He parries her strike by grabbing her wrist with just the right amount of force not to hurt her. Of course, grabbing Ryu close to her hand is just inflaming her nerves even more, and she throws Belle unconscious. And to get away from everybody, she princess carries Belle. Like, I like to see that animated. We have Ryu resting Belle on her lap. I'm very envious of you, Belle, at that moment. Very envious. And she like whispers to Belle like, "I could never hate you." And we have sneaky Belle pretending to be unconscious, just like in volume 14. Sneaky Belle. But the two of them are finally able to talk normally to each other again. I did find it really funny when Ryu was like, "No, it's nothing with you. I just can't look at your face." I'm like, Ryu, how can anyone not misunderstand what you just said? When Belle asked Ryu to like tell him more about Elise and Astrea Familia, in my mind, because I love the idea of a Belle and Ryu pairing, it's Belle like asking Ryu, "I want to know more about you." And so we get that story. We get the story of how Ryu first came into Auraria, how she left her village of elves at the age of 11. A lot of the characters in DanMachi seem to like have more adult-like responsibilities, are more mature at a very early age. Like, it really does feel like a medieval time where people that are much younger than we would think of in modern day are taking on these responsibilities. Like, Aiz was an adventurer before she was 10. Aina worked at the guild at 14. Ryu leaving her home at 11 and going into Aurario. Like, so many of these people are so young and taking on these crazy responsibilities. But we have Ryu entering Aurario, and she's been in that like racist environment around her elven forest where they just look down on all other races. And that type of environment has ingrained like certain instincts upon her where she like brushes off everyone's hand, and that makes it very difficult for her to find a place in Aurario. And she vents those frustrations to Astrea, who she meets for the first time. And Astrea notes that what she needs isn't the word of a god, but someone that's an equal, a friend. And that's when Ryu eventually gets cornered by Jura. We know Jura, that great cat boy from Lucha Familia in volume 13. And concerning Jura, there is something mentioned in Astrea Record, which is the 3rd anniversary mobile game event from DanMemo, about 7 years in the past, about Astrea Familia, Loki Familia, and Freya Familia fighting against the evils. And they do mention Jura in that event, and that's exactly what that is referencing, this moment in volume 15, where Jura and friends corner Ryu and thinking about selling her to the pleasure quarter, and that makes me very angry. And of course, Elise is there to the rescue, and Elise's personality is something else. Like, she's this super self-confident person, but she's not like egotistical. Like, she is very much like a good person, but with a lot of self-confidence. Like, I am a beautiful adventurer who's aiming to become level 2. All right, Elise. And then we have that bond forming between Ryu and Elise. Elise calling Ryu pig-headed and stubborn. It's really funny. And they just kind of hit it off. And then Elise tries to practice with Ryu about the whole touching hand thing. And Elise, like, pretty much gets to grab Ryu's hand, no problem. And then Ryu doesn't understand why, but she's not really pulling back. And Elise is like a tiny bit disappointed, like, hey, I thought it would be harder than this. And again, Ryu doesn't understand it herself, but we know that later on, the hands that she has allowed to touch her are Elise, Seer, and finally, Belle. But we get to see the beginnings of Astrea Familia. They're all very new. Elise is not even level 2 yet. They're all like starting out, and it's just a shame what happens to that Familia. And I really hope that, again, Ryu finds a new Familia to be in. Astrea is still around, so again, I keep saying this. I think a lot of the things are just pointing towards Ryu eventually joining Hestia Familia. It just makes sense to me. But we do have to find Astrea first to unlock Ryu's Falna. And I feel like when that happens, she's going to get her status updated, and she's obviously going to be level 5. And I'm interested to see what her stats would be, because she hasn't had her status updated in 5 years, and she's been getting all this Excelia against the Black Goliath, which Lily explicitly mentions in Volume 6. Like, most of the Excelia from the Black Goliath probably went to Ryu. And then she, of course, does the finishing blow against Juggernaut. She fought Asterius for a bit in Volume 10. She's been through so much. So, very interested to see what her stats would be right before that level up to 5. And I think that's when it would happen, when she would join Hestia Familia, is when Belle becomes level 5. That way, Ryu is not joining Hestia Familia at a higher level than Belle. Belle will remain the highest level in the Familia. So when Belle becomes level 5, I think that's when Ryu will join Hestia Familia. However, they get contact with Astrea and have Ryu's status unlocked. I'm talking too much about Ryu, probably. And then we go into the next interlude, which is about Haruhime. So here we have Haruhime's magic stats already at D. So she is eligible for a level up, but again, as I mentioned, they decide not to do that, because what is Haruhime going to do with her level 2 status when she can't really fight that well? And they want her to. They don't want her just to focus on sorcery. Haruhime doesn't want that. I find it hilarious what Aisha said earlier. Well, what she could do with level 2 status? Trip over herself and like crash into monsters to kill them? Like, picturing that in my mind is really funny. But basically, we see that Haruhime has been working very, very hard to prove herself, because she's grew up in a very aristocrat like family, so she's really hasn't had to want for anything. She really wanted to relate to the orphans, but felt like she was a tiny bit out of place. But we see here that she's been working really, really hard for the Familia and trying to improve herself. Like, it's mentioned that she did her sorcery training. Immediately after that, she trained with Take on martial arts and self-defense, and that's what helps them later on in Volume 14. And Mikoto has been watching that entire time, always trying to support Haruhime, but not like directly help her, because Haruhime wants to do things with her own strength. And it's cool to see that Omori Sensei is having Haruhime like try to be more active, seeing her like try different weapons, this time a stave. I'm very curious to see if she like gets any combat proficiency later on in the series. If she's gonna get any more magic besides like buff magic. Very interested to see where Omori Sensei takes Haruhime's character. And one thing that was kind of ominous was saying that Lily was teaching Haruhime all these things about being a supporter, almost like in preparation in the event that something were to happen to Lily. And now it's probably just a precaution thing that makes sense to do, but it almost like raised like a flag for me. But then I remember the afterword where Omori Sensei said he always wanted Lily to be level 1, so I don't know. it makes me worried for Lily now. It makes me really worried for Lily. And then the novel concludes with the Elegia, I don't know how to pronounce it, but the festival, this celebration, this mourning for fall adventures. And we get very interesting scenes between Eyes and Belle. And with Eyes, she's in that simple little dress, and she promises those children that she will kill the Black Dragon, and you can't help but feel like the Black Dragon is something very personal to Eyes. And we see that with volume 8 of the main series, where she has this big moment of distaste on her face when she's looking at those Black Dragon scale shrines scattered throughout that village. And then here we have Belle going through that graveyard with those flowers. And a really cool touch is that those flowers were bought from that elderly couple shop that Lily recommends. So like all these stories just kind of tying together in a cool way, and I really appreciate how Omori sensei does that with his writing. And we see that Eyes leaves that flower in front of a specific gravestone by the memorial that celebrates the heroes of the Dungeon Oratoria. And what is that left in front of? And Belle takes note of this. It's left in front of Albert, like the main hero from that story. And then he tries to recall something. It's a title that Albert had before. And it's, I don't know if I'm reading this correctly, but it's like Waldstein or something like that. Waldstein, the mercenary king, and mercenaries eventually became known as the present day adventurers. So the adventurer king. And Belle like makes that connection, like Waldstein, Wallenstein, hold up. And I'm glad that Belle isn't, again, completely oblivious to these things. Like, hold up, this is weird. They must be connected somehow. Is it just a coincidence? And then before this, we have like that autonomy between Belle and Eyes. How it's mentioned in the novel that Belle wants to leave a flower so he doesn't forget what happened, but Eyes leaves a flower so she doesn't lose herself, because those of us who are into Sororatoria know that Eyes is kind of motivated by revenge, and sometimes she can lose herself in that. And again, revenge for what? And then Albert, Waldstein, Wallenstein. What's going on here, guys? What's going on? Because there are theories that Albert is the father of Eyes, and with all the imagery we've seen like in the anime, like that makes sense. But how does it make sense? He's this ancient warrior. If that was the case, how is Eyes his daughter, but him being from so far in the past? How is Eyes here in the present? And if that is related to like a untranslated short story, I don't want to know it, guys. I'm sure that when Omori Sensei wants us to know about Eyes' like true origins, we'll find out through the main series. He's always said that any big revelations we're going to do about the characters will be done in the main series. So I'm sure it's just not the time for Omori Sensei to say explicitly what happened with Eyes here. But the connection between Albert and Eyes is undeniable. And then in the afterword, I mentioned some of this stuff in here before, how most of these stories are short stories from previous things Omori Sensei has written for the Blu-ray releases of the first season. But he also mentions that the next story is going to be about the Tavern Girls, so a focus on those from the pub. And judging from the cover of Volume 16, one of those is definitely Seer. And again, I've done my best to avoid any spoilers about that novel, and I hope to continue to do so, because I really don't want that spoiled for me. But man, guys, Volume 15, like, I like it as a whole. It's a nice read. It's just that the timing of Volume 15's release is just unfortunate, because at this point, a lot of us are just starving for development of the main plot itself, and then having Volume 16 release in October for Japan, and then trying to avoid everyone that's like seen the summaries of it. Like, it just makes you want to get to that point much faster. So the timing of Volume 15's release is very unfortunate, because it could be a downer to some people wanting to see like more development in regards to the main plot of the story. And I totally get that. Like, I felt some of that reading this myself. And it's just the year-long wait's just unfortunate because Volume 14 came out December 2019, and then Sword Oratoria 11 came out in January, and then Oratoria Volume 12 came out in July, I believe, either June and July. But 2 Sword Oratoria volumes came out between Volume 14 the main series and Volume 15 the main series. So again, really weird how it took this long to get Volume 15 out, especially considering that different translators work on the different series, and that Volume 12 of Sword Oratoria is mega long. So it's like, why did it take so long for Volume 15 to come out? Hopefully we don't get a similar wait for Volume 16. Hopefully it doesn't take too much longer to come out, because it's getting really hard avoiding these spoilers for Volume 16. The next DanMachi content that's untranslated is just Volume 16, so hopefully it comes to us sooner than later. I don't want to be behind the Japanese release like by a volume again, because we shouldn't have to be at this point, because we're caught up pretty much on everything. But anyway, I'm curious what your thoughts are on Volume 15 yourself. Like, what was your favorite short story? Who's your favorite character to learn more about in this? What do you think is going to happen in the future of the series? Like, what do you think about Ryu joining Hestia Familia? Nothing about Volume 16, please. Like, no spoilers if you've read the summaries about it. But yeah, guys, again, leave your comments down below about the volume itself. We don't know when the next volume is coming out. We'll just have to pray that it comes out sooner than later, and I'll try to keep you guys updated if Yen Press announces a date for Volume 16. But this brings us to the end of new translated DanMachi content for a while, guys. Until, I guess, the DanMachi Season 3 OVA, which really just looks like a lot of fan service. And of course, there's always the mobile game DanMemo for fun little events every now and then. If you want to see me continue to cover more DanMachi content as it releases, go ahead, give this video a like, sub to the channel, follow me on Twitter, and join my Discord. And as always, continue enjoying your time adventuring in Mario and the dungeon. This is Lorne, your guild advisor, signing out.